Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to kind of share our latest industry report with you all and have a discussion with our great panelists. It looks like there's lots of new faces on in the audience as well. So just for those of you, I guess, who maybe wouldn't be that familiar with Health Excel, very briefly, we are a digital health community and we're trying to kind of bring together the insights and the people to really move the needle in digital health and kind of solve some of the biggest industry challenges. The purpose of the webinar today really is to kind of discuss our latest industry report, which is on routes to market for digital therapeutics. And we've released it in two parts. So the first part is specifically focused on employer partnerships, and that's what we'll be tackling today. But I guess for a bit more context, really, the digital therapeutic space is an area that we've been tracking really closely for the last number of years. We released our first report on it back in 2018. And at that stage, really what we were trying to do was kind of differentiate digital therapeutics from the broader digital health space. And what we found when we were kind of looking at that, I guess, back then was that, digital health means a lot of things to so many people. It's quite used very loosely, and it's sort of subsumed everything to do with health technology. So the challenge back then was kind of how do meaningful companies sort of stand out from the crowd and separate themselves? And what transpired was that digital therapeutics really became that term to differentiate. And we worked quite closely with the Digital Therapeutics Alliance and others in the industry to kind of define that space. But what came off the back of that definition, and, kind of making claims about treatment and managing and preventing conditions, was that there was such widespread adoption of that term digital therapeutics because it almost meant, this works. So then kind of fast forwarding to early 2021, there was sort of a need to differentiate the space even further. And what transpired there was that a subset of DTx called prescription digital therapeutics is kind of what came to the limelight. So we released a second report on digital therapeutics, focusing specifically on prescription DTx. But I think what we've seen over the past year is that the market has evolved again so rapidly. And now we're kind of moving away from needing to sort of define and segment the market. And now the focus really is on, how do we actually commercialize these solutions? How do we think about what the correct route to market is for the different digital therapeutics? So, we've been really working on trying to find some answers to that and hope that the report and the discussion today will kind of spark some interesting insights in that space. I wanted to kind of let everyone know on the line as well that the full report that I'm mentioning is available exclusively to our members. So Laura has kindly dropped a link in the chat there if anyone would like to access it. So I guess just to give everyone kind of an overview of what to expect today, we'll have some members from the advisory team presenting some of the key findings from our report, and then we'll follow that with a panel discussion with some of the folks on the line here. So maybe before we get into that, I'll just take a minute to introduce myself and the panelists and speakers today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sophie and I'm the strategy and insights manager here at Health Excel. And maybe I'll pass it over to the panelists if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Maybe I'll go first. Rich D'Annunzio, pleasure to meet everybody. I'm new to Health Excel because I'm new to the digital therapeutics, coming in from working at large pharma and doing a bunch of commercial leadership roles in large pharma. I'm currently leading our commercial team here at Click Therapeutics based in New York City, who are developing software as medical device, and like Sophie says, have prescription digital therapeutics as well as general digital therapeutics that we go B2B to employers. So look forward to discussion today. And Will, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rich. So I'm Will. I coordinate most of the stuff that we do within Health Octopus Ventures. There's 10 of us looking only at health-related businesses, and that team of 10 is comprised of clinicians, academics, and commercial folks. I also have the pleasure of working with a number of digital therapeutics companies, including sitting on the board of Quit Genius, working with Big Health, and more recently we've made a number of investments in kind of menopause, and sexual health and a bunch of other areas within digital health. So excited to be part of the conversation. And I'll hand over to Eugene.
I was going to say, I kind of like this tag next. Good to see you guys. So Eugene Borohovich, I am a co-founder and CEO of Your Coach Health, where we actually are working with a number of digital health and digital therapeutic companies to surround health coaching around their product or service. That's one. Also been a long-standing advisor to Health Excel on some of their growth. And earlier this year, had a DTx podcast where Will and Jonas actually were part of, kind of telling their story. And so that was a fun exercise where, while I'm not a practitioner of DTx, I got to learn through sort of their voices. That's me in a nutshell. And I'm gonna pass it on to Jinsey.
Thanks, Eugene. So I'm Jinsey. I'm a digital health analyst in the Health Excel advisory team here. So nice to meet you all. And I pass it on to Laura.
Thanks so much, Jinsey. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura, and I'm one of the digital health consultants here at Health Excel. So great to meet you all. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. And then I think it's just Jonas left to go, I guess.
That's it.
Thank you. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Jonas Das. I'm one of the co-founders of Kaya Health. At the beginning, I was quite focused on building out our second product line, which is pulmonary rehabilitation for COPD patients. And then I moved over to the US to build out our commercial team over here in the US. So my historical focus is a little bit more on kind of building out new solutions to match a particular unmet need. And then at the beginning, while I was still in Europe, had a lot of conversations with pharma and more on the prescription digital therapeutic side. And then as I moved over to the US, the employer and health plan kind of population health approach became more and more important. Pleasure to be here. I'll pass it back to Sarah. That's Sophie, sorry.
No problem, Jonas. Thanks so much. Great. So we'll have Laura and Jinsey now present some of the findings from our report. So hand it over to you guys and you can share your screen.
Thanks, Sophie. So just on the next slide then, Laura. So this is the first section of the report that we'll be looking at. That's current approaches to commercialization. So in this report, we have analyzed over 100 digital therapeutics or DTx solutions for their routes to market and therapy focus. We found that since 2018, there has been a twofold increase in the number of DTx solutions out in the market. And of those, almost 20% are in development and clinical trial stages. Next slide, please. So from our analysis here on the commercialization strategies for DTx, we found that at present, provider, employer, and D2C routes are the leading routes to market. And interestingly, and perhaps contrary to what many might expect, only 14% of DTx companies are focused on pharma collaborations as a main route to market. We suspect that this may be a result of stringent clinical evidence and regulatory requirements of that industry, and perhaps also pharma's limited experience within the DTx commercialization space. Next slide, please. So on the slide here, then we have categorized DTx into different modalities, which we have labeled as PDT, that's prescription digital therapeutics, OTC, that's over-the-counter ones, standalone, and combination. And definitions for these can be found in the glossary of our report. But from our analysis here, we found that unsurprisingly, PDT ones get into the hands of patients via the provider route, whereas the over-the-counter DTx are more suitable for D2C or employer modes. Also, a large portion of combination DTx are opting for pharma route to market, possibly by offering digital therapies as an enhancement alongside existing pharmacotherapies or as an ad hoc to the treatment. Next slide, please. So we have also conducted a therapeutic assessment of DTx solutions, which is reproduced on this slide here. As you can see, mental health and behavior change are the therapy areas with the highest proportion of DTx solutions at present. And interestingly, besides mental health and cardiometabolic disease areas, we are now seeing an expansion of DTx into newer therapy areas, such as gastroenterology, nephrology, and inflammatory, which we have covered under the umbrella category of other. So overall, from our analysis, the majority of solutions in mental health space seem to be available to the end user, either through employer or D2C routes. So Laura will now share some insights on how DTx companies can offer their solution through the employer route. Over to you, Laura.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jinsey. Yeah, so I'm going to take us through the first kind of section that we focused on for this report, and that would be the employer route to market for digital therapeutics. So I guess, what do we mean when we say the employer route to market? So this is a business to consumer entry point in which a digital therapeutic company will target employers as their customer base in order to reach their employees as their end users. So solutions in this market must demonstrate their ability to reduce medical spend for employers and consequently allow for tangible financial savings. And this employer route depends greatly on regional variations in healthcare infrastructure and workplace cultures. So it's a strong route to entry in the US specifically, particularly through brokering agencies helping employers choose best-in-class solutions for their employee base. So throughout the report, we constructed flowcharts such as this one to outline if a particular market entry route suits a DTx solution. The branches vary per route for reasons that will become evident as each section is read. For the employer route, you'll see that we have 3 branches, and they're based on geography, clinical validation, and therapeutic area. So as already touched upon, the primary consideration for utilization of the employer route is whether or not the product will be targeted at the US market, where DTx can have success selling to employers given the focus on healthcare coverage, particularly around prevention by digital therapeutics. So in other markets such as the EU, employer benefit systems are not as mature, and it would probably be worth exploring alternative routes. The next consideration is the status of clinical validation studies. So evidence requirements for employers are more centered around financials. So if no clinical validation has been completed, this route may be a good option to pursue. And of course, having clinical validation doesn't rule out the employer route to market, but more so this is a consideration if you don't have it yet. And then finally, but just as important, we would consider the therapeutic area. So employers by their nature are going to prefer solutions that will apply to a large cohort of their employee base. It's unfeasible for them to juggle multiple niche solutions as benefits. And so prevalent areas such as mental health and metabolic disease would be much better suited to this route rather than rarer or low volume therapeutic areas. Our key insight from authoring this section, and what we wanted to highlight today, was the move towards consolidation that we've begun to witness in the employer route. So I've already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, employers are going to want solutions that are applicable to large portions of their workforce. And in the coming years, employers are projected to move away from point solutions such as chronic health condition platforms. Instead, like in many other areas of health, the focus is shifting towards larger platforms that cover a range of behavioral and medical health conditions. And these larger offerings simplify access to care and allow for a single entry point to digital care, which is increasingly being recognized as pivotal, given the dawn of knowledge around the interconnectedness of medical conditions, and also given the rise of interest in comorbidity management. And again, so for employers, this simplification is key. An employee base is diverse in needs, and consolidated solutions offering a range of applications will be the most attractive. So we wanted to dive into this consolidation route a little further in this section, and we viewed 2 sub-entry points within the employer route itself. The route in red is the direct route, wherein the DTx company would approach the employer directly in order to put their solution forward and work out how best to offer it to the relevant employees. From an employer perspective, this is not very efficient, since they would have to engage individually with each vendor. The alternative route in green is more streamlined. In this, what we've called the indirect route, there's an additional step in advance of employer engagement, where the DTx company will work with either a navigation or benefits broker, or even partner with another digital health service provider to offer their product as part of a consolidated solution. So there are a few different middlemen who can come into play here between the DTx company and the employer. Navigation brokers such as Accolade and Grand Rounds help employees to find relevant solutions within their employer benefit package and understand what is being offered to them. Benefit brokers such as Solera go one step further and actually provide the solution to the employees. And then there's also telehealth platforms or other service providers available, which have seen a significant rise in uptake and usage over the course of the pandemic. So a notable real-world example of this was the acquisition of virtual mental health company SilverCloud Health by the US telehealth giant Amwell in July of this year. And Blue Shield California now offers AML as a benefit to their employees, which means that Silver Cloud is accessible to a user base of over 7,000 employees. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. It appears that we're heading towards a market where large-based solutions augment themselves to different user channels via digital therapeutics or DTx. And we need to consider how seamlessly to integrate these solutions and not have a point solution experience from the patient side with multiple logons to one platform. So essentially what we're asking here is, does consolidation equate to coherence for the end user, or is it still a disjointed experience? So just to finish, based on everything we'd learned when authoring this section, we've put together a checklist of key considerations if the employer route to market is one that you're looking to pursue. So the first one is, can your solution integrate? So DTx solutions proposed for this entry route must be able to integrate into other platforms. As we said, employers don't want to deal with multiple isolated solutions. They want everything bundled together. The second consideration is, can it reduce medical spend? Which, as we said, is a key metric of success for employers. And also, do you have tangible proof of that reduction in medical spend? And then finally, and an interesting one is, does it facilitate family inclusion? So consideration needs to be given to users as groups. Many employees have codependents or spouses who are also included in their health plan, which can complicate price modeling. So there's an opportunity within this to leverage family inclusion as a tool for both recruitment and retention. So that concludes our overview of part one of the Health Excel Go-to-Market report. And I'll now hand back to Sophie to get our panel discussion going. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura and Jinsy. I think there's loads to pick up there and discuss. Maybe, Richard, we could start with you and ask from a DTx perspective. I know Click have kind of explored various different routes to market for the different products you have. So how did you land on the employer route specifically for Click-a-Team?
Yeah, no, great question, and great job summarizing that report. If you haven't read it, definitely read it. And maybe I can take a step back real quick and think about Click Therapeutics. We have two large partnerships with pharma, PDT focus, Pipeline is prescription digital therapeutic focus, and then we have one product that's really digital therapeutics, that's B2B. That's a product called Click-a-Team, which is smoking cessation. We have about 15 million covered lives. Now, I'll say I'm definitely the least experienced out of everybody here when it comes to selling into employers from a DTx perspective, because my background is in pharma, large pharma, commercial roles, called on employers, but the PBMs really, for the most part, guide formulary and drug decisions there. So I'm coming in here and I'm really learning a decent amount from our perspective. And so I think, Sophie, to your question is really, where is Click going and how did we move forward? We were selling direct, going back to the slide, Laura, that you put forth, but we have since been changing that. And I've only been here for 6 months, but I think some of the key learnings that I had, and maybe I could share some of those if it's okay, because that really is going to guide how we're commercializing here. One of the things that I've heard since connecting with employers, really talking to kind of the leaders in health and wellness and the benefit side, some CMOs, but they're getting inundated from a digital perspective. It's tough to do the one-off contracts. And if there's a platform, like you said, with multiple products, which we do not have with Click-a-Team, it's much better. So that was kind of learning one, we don't have a platform. Two, there's really focus areas overall that I've heard over the course that they're thinking about, going back to that large population that you spoke about: depression, anxiety, diabetes, obesity, and musculoskeletal, really the top 5 that just kept coming up. Again, we don't fit into them. And they also think is, although even if we secure a contract or sell to employers, we still have to activate them. So you have to think about kind of the marketing angle from that. The other learning that I had was from an incumbent factor, that I'm calling it anyway. If there's a smoking cessation product that's there, or if it's even Quick Genius that has a platform, it's tough to overcome. And so as I learned from employers, they really want an engaging product, they want outcomes, and that's really deciding kind of the payment model from there. So taking that all in consideration from a Click perspective, we're changing a lot of what we do from commercialization, because although we segmented and really went door to door, we just chose the large employers. We are really shifting more to where that slide had outlined, which was more of the platform-based, the indirect base. So we are working with Solera. We're using our tech team, which is very good at integrating on platforms, integrating in Verge and Pulse. So, the employer doesn't have to figure out and choose a product that they have to contract for. And so then we're taking those platforms and understanding the employers under there, and we're starting to segment them. And so we're segmenting those from our viewpoint, which is going to be very different, I'm sure, from those that are on the line. But for smoking cessation, you know, a company like Deloitte, for example, we're not going to go after them because we still have to activate them. Not a lot of smokers. Union manufacturing, a lot of smokers, but don't hit the persona that we have, which for smoking cessation, which is really women between the ages of 20 and 25. So we're segmenting the employers that we can focus on, that want to engage, and that have a population that we can engage with, like health, you know, from a healthcare perspective. And so that's kind of our number one route. We are still doing direct to employer, but we're segmenting them very differently because the employers, the large employers, are pretty sophisticated. They're on a rigid timeline. What I saw is that these mid-sized employers have less rigid timelines. They're not just focused on those 5 areas that I spoke about. And if an employer has a bundled solution in a platform, and smoking cessation is one of them, we also cross that off the list as well. So we're taking a very different segmented approach as we wind up going in there. Still putting the product first and selling the value of outcomes and having a payment model that matches, but definitely from a click perspective changed over the last couple months, and we'll see how this winds up playing out. So hopefully, Sophie, that answered the question.
Yeah, that's super. Thank you for sharing that, Rich. I think loads of elements there. It might be interesting while we have, you know, Jonas on the line as well, to hear from another DTx perspective how they kind of approached it, and if you had similar kind of challenges and thoughts around it.
Yeah, sure. Rich covered a lot of ground there, and I think his perspective is really interesting because I think there's not many other companies outside of Click and Kaya that have kind of both the prescription digital therapeutic and the population health model within like the same umbrella of company. So it's really interesting for me to also hear some of the things that he was facing coming from pharma into kind of this employer world. I do think engagement or volume maybe also is very, very key with employer populations. If you are not in these 3 top spending categories, you better be able to explain why your niche is so relevant to that particular population. But even then, I think you have to be very, very targeted with your marketing so that you can really cut through the noise, because these clients are so overwhelmed. So I loved his examples around, you know, how Click-a-Teen specifically has their personas and knows which employers to talk to. I think the broker category, or the importance of the brokers and consultants in this space hasn't been highlighted so much maybe. I do think it's crazy how gated this market has become for if you want to be able to approach or get a chance at signing the very large employers, the enterprise clients, the jumbo accounts, so to say, you're always going to run into an RFP process, and that RFP process is usually going to be led by a benefits consultant, and that consultant is being paid usually by billable hours, which means they want to go in depth. They have an incentive to build out and vet these solutions really well, make sure that, you know, answers around integration are answered. Usually you already have to redline a contract upfront. So I think that's maybe another point that we're seeing. There's more and more of this consolidation. You can also see it on the contracting front, that an employer is just so overwhelmed that they prefer outsourcing the whole process, at least in the enterprise segment, so that you can go through one contracting. It's all handled by your benefits consultant, and it means that the resources of kind of vetting these solutions usually sit with the consultant and not with the employer themselves. So that, I think, is a big learning about just the marketing from a B2B side, apart from the member marketing, that you just need to be able to somehow cut through the noise and create these relationships in the benefits consultants community.
I just wanted to maybe add one more thing and just jump in here. And I think, you know, there's that second level, and I think Jonas, you alluded to member marketing, right? Because depending on which route you take, obviously, if you're going direct to employer for quicker decision making, but also to a certain extent, maybe more direct access through that employer to the member population, right? And to the talent. Yes, that's a potentially much longer pathway, right? Just because they are bombarded and they're preferring, multitude of solutions through one. On the other side, you're sitting multiple layers away from that end consumer of that service, right? And that member marketing, in the picture, for example, in the report, you have the Teledoc or Amway, apologies, and many other Blue Cross, et cetera. And so getting the word out to those consumers ultimately is the other side of the double-edged sword.
I can piggyback on that too. I learned that real quick from my perspective. If the employer is not engaging and you can't get to the employee, you really don't get the uptake. At least for my, for the product that Click has, those employers that are engaged 4 to 5 times, the uptake and activations that we see from there. And so that's a really important point as we get to commercialization and really activation and marketing there. If you can get the employer to buy into this in order to get, down to their employee is extremely helpful, at least from my perspective so far.
I think that's, I know both from Quick Genius and Big Health, where we would celebrate the contract signing as being like, great, like big result, but actually it's like that's the start of the game of actually how do you get access to the end consumers. And that's typically quite a sensitive one as well, and normally one that ends up becoming parts of the set contracted terms of, and actually becomes part of the pricing negotiation, because it's such an important lever to have access, and whether that's by SMS or whatever data that's being shared. And I think it's also quite interesting how that dynamic is potentially different in different therapeutic areas. And so for something like opioid addiction or alcoholism, like actually trying to get end user engagement via the employer channel for such an emotive area of health is also a challenge that I don't know many companies that have actually built a playbook yet for. So I think version 1 of that playbook of employee engagement is there, but quite interested to see what kind of version 2 looks like as the employer, because in some ways that there should be perfect alignment between the employer and the therapeutics providers. But that isn't necessarily what in practice like we seem to be actually experiencing.
And I think it's somewhat tough for a company in the earlier stage to figure out, what are the right terms for a contract that has platform play in it, because you don't really understand yet necessarily kind of the top of funnel you can reach through those channels. However, you're giving up some of that activation play that you can then less influence. So, and oftentimes you have to agree to certain terms, or certain platforms, have reward systems behind them and how they try to activate and incentivize members. And then kind of juxtaposing that with maybe your pricing model, where you have more flexibility when you're selling directly, and where you're putting terms in that you can access kind of member marketing directly. I think is really tough at the beginning when you don't really know yet where the volume is going to come from through these different channels.
It is quite interesting, that piece of, I suppose, like business model innovation versus products, because in some ways like the digital therapeutics space is still fairly nascent, and almost like generation 1 is digital therapeutics work, and all the naysayers are being proven wrong through RCTs and health economics. But then actually like what's the next generation of digital therapeutics, but actually digital therapeutic infrastructure, and that piece around like doing smart stuff with pricing and pricing dynamically. It'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out, because I suppose one strategy that Quick Genius uses to quite strong effect is putting fees at risk. And so we typically see a 50% quit rate, and actually saying to customers, like, if we don't hit that quit rate, then you won't pay our fees. Is actually, once you've built enough, and maybe to Rich's point as well around like that segmentation piece, once you've got a view on enrollment and efficacy, you can then start doing some quite interesting things with pricing to try and expedite that process, which otherwise can typically stall like fairly easily?
I don't know if we go to questions here, but I think Will just hit on something that was in a question here. It talks about like how to engage employers. If you're coming about this a little bit differently, I think the model that Will just spoke about and putting your product at risk is one of those ones that'll get the eyes to open and somebody to listen at the end of the day. Because if the product is engaging and proving clinical efficacy, then it's really a question of how do you put your money where your mouth is. And I see that even more so on the employer side. The sophistication, though, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, at the employer from a data perspective and understanding clinical outcomes and presenting it, it's quite different. I'm seeing from even talking to the clients of the PBMs I used to talk to, because they're definitely very different. And so, you have to get something that's simplistic, but yet an outcomes based, I think will at least get you a foot in the door. And I think Jonas hit on a good point around the EBCs that I haven't been able to really see some traction there from my perspective, but that's also another way I can see some of that helping to get them to buy in on it, to then convince the employers of this different, solution that you're speaking of.
I think you had as well. Sorry, Eugene, did you want to come in?
No, go ahead, Sophie.
Sure. I was just going to pick up on, I think there was kind of discussion there around the broad of like the types of employers that are being targeted by some of these DTx and kind of going beyond some of the traditional ones. And then kind of thinking about like the traditional therapeutic areas that are covered as well. I think our report had mental health, cardiometabolic, all the top ones, female health. But do you think as there's a broadening of the types of employers that people are kind of exploring, we'll also see a broadening of the therapeutic areas that they're willing to cover? Is that, and has COVID kind of impacted that in a way as well, to bring up COVID?
I can give my opinion. Like I said, I'm probably the least one that understands the employer market, but I understand that they're inundated with a lot of things in front of them right now. So I absolutely see, as the broadening happens, because you're seeing employees that are engaged with the digital solutions, that they will want to offer more. The question is then, how do they make decisions in order to offer that? And what role do other avenues play into that, the EBCs or the PBMs, the digital formularies like the ESI has or even CVS has, that really support and help them? Budgets also have to come into play here, as they can't have this unlimited approach here and all of these differential pricing aspects. So to me, I see the short answer is yes. The question is, in my mind, is it going to get so complicated where you're going to see them pulling back quite a bit as all of these continued solutions wind up coming on, would be one. And then two, there's also a pharmacy benefit that they're also managing too, where costs are going out. Where's the overlap from there? And we're going in and talking about, diabetes management and prevention, where there's diabetes, drugs on a formulary that are also in there. So where does cost overlay with that, and where do the PBMs get involved? So I think it's going to have to evolve quite a bit, but as you're seeing the engagement from employees pick up and coming out of COVID, I absolutely think that it's going to continue to progress. It's one of the reasons why I came over to Click, but I think it has a lot of work to get there to be more sophisticated.
It does feel like there's the full spectrum of sophistication. Like you pitch to an Amazon, and they bring out their full health economics team with X number of clinicians and talk about statistical methodologies. Like you have that at one end of the spectrum, and then to far smaller employer clients who say, actually, we don't have the infrastructure to run this ourselves, but speak to Willis Towers Watson or one of our PBMs, like it needs to be on their paper. And so you have like the full spectrum, but it's quite interesting more from a company building perspective of how do you get to that first million, 5 or 10 million in revenue. And I don't think it's necessarily obvious from the outside, like which employers maybe have the highest risk appetite and willingness to really engage. And if I look at like Quit Genius's first 10 customers or Big Health's first 10 customers, there isn't much kind of rhyme or reason or like pattern in them from the outside, which also makes it harder, I think, for entrepreneurs in this space to know, right, okay, who are the clients that we should be going after first?
It's interesting because ultimately a lot of the digital therapeutics are designed for that end consumer / patient, right? And there's something to be said around, and I listened to the A16Z podcast with Julie, talking about kind of the B2C to B, and there's nothing better than employees themselves asking their employer for a particular solution and tool, right? And I think, just to use, I think actually, if I'm not mistaken, Jonas, Kaya, right? You guys, yes, started in Germany, right? And sort of entered the employer model in US, but there was some consumerism to this. I mean, Big Health or Quid Genius too, right? Well, I don't want to, put words into the mouth of the companies, but I think, back to this, market engaging those members, and do you have the right talent to drive that consumerism type of adoption, and then heading back with, by the way, with those data points and the analytics around even the return on that investment and the clinical decisions that can be made by those same employers, right? But it takes a different DNA.
And I think you're hitting a great point, Eugene, talking about, taking into consideration, we're really talking about employers in the US here, and how if you are or starting to think about your company and targeting, addressing a condition that may be more niche, that may be less prevalent than 20% or 10%, or again, smoking cessation is a very high prevalence in certain populations, that maybe you also look kind of globally at what market you want to target when, because I do think that the US is just, when we compare it with Germany or Europe, where we have this Digital Healthcare Act model, where you can go one national regulatory route to kind of get your prescription digital therapeutic cleared for reimbursement, for national reimbursement. It might be worth looking at that model and kind of getting ready for that model to eventually be there in the US too. For me, the best parallel model, so to say, is probably the digital formularies that are coming from the PBMs, but we just don't see that much adoption yet. And I would not bet my whole company on that model right now, if I was kind of starting off with a particular condition and going to the US. And so I do think it has gotten very, very noisy. And if you are, kind of targeting a condition that is very low prevalence, you might be better advised, talking with pharmaceutical companies about strategic partnerships for distribution in the US market for that case.
It's quite an interesting one. Sorry.
So I was actually going to jump on something I think you said earlier, that, kind of the first wave of this was, does it work, right? And is there evidence? And I think as the evidence mounted, right, and some of the early kind of trailblazers drove that, I do believe we're in that phase now of the wild, wild west of channels. And, given the resources of the startups and companies, yes, you have to be meticulous in how you choose them, but also opportunistic in looking kind of the 360 around and listening to the market. And I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of this experimentation, to use, not to kind of throw the PBMs, there are, PBMs, health plans, all of these larger players are sort of bundling a lot of these digital therapies together and putting them in the formulary, et cetera. But then is there an ROI for that company / startup to go through those cycles for PBM in the short term? Maybe, maybe not, right? But I think it's the wild, wild west of channels right now that we're seeing what lands where.
You look at like Livongo, I think 70% of their revenue comes through channel partnerships, PBMs, and the like. And so I think that playbook means that actually, arguably, the most important people in a lot of the DTx businesses are those individuals owning those strategic relationships, the kind of the riches of the world. I'm sure, Rich, your phone is off the hook in terms of recruiters. And I know that for most of our companies, it's the hardest role to find, and is one of the most important. But it's also such a slow burn in terms of some of these payer relationships that might take 2 years, but actually in the first year you might land $20 or $50 million through it. And so it's quite an exciting journey, but quite kind of nerve-wracking that your business could be largely dependent on a very small number of like strategic partnerships, and how do you resource that or even know that your approach is correct when the feedback cycle just takes so long?
It kind of begs the question a little bit, what will be the big aggregators in the, like 3 to 5 years from now? And I'd be interested in kind of hearing from this panel what you guys think, because the opinions go in all directions.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting, especially more from a fundraising perspective, that whenever any of our companies raise, and when they talk to some of the large US funds and they say, well, we can't invest because we think we're conflicted, and they give a company like, we're not conflicted, but that's interesting that you think you are, because clearly that is where they see the strategic roadmap for a particular company. And so whether that's a Lyra or a Spring or someone like that, it feels like there is a race to be the consolidator versus the consolidated, and actually looking at how people are building their narratives around how their particular therapeutic area is consolidation proof, that actually what they do is such a kind of unique and sophisticated area, such that Livongo couldn't build it or they couldn't buy us. It's quite an interesting dynamic, and I think we'll see only more of that as the level of investment into these companies increases, because like if you're putting 1, 2 or 500 million to work into one of these companies, like you need to be confident that there is still a strategic outcome versus this is going to be a bolt-on.
It's interesting, we've been talking the employer route, but if you think about it, I think even the PDT, the prescription, right? I mean, let's just use Pear as the example. With a couple $100 million in the bank, they are also going to start consolidating. That's my 2 cents on it. Different therapeutic area and going through that market, as a platform, consolidating, deep prescription digital therapies, right? So you can start looking at these consolidations, I think, in both the employer, consumer, and but to Jonas's question, I mean, my bet, actually, believe it or not, I think we're going to see more aggressiveness from the health plans, and we've seen some and primary care, and we just saw some announcement with CVS, right? So I do think that ultimately the health plans or the behemoths that own quite a lot will be consolidating even more of that.
Or folks that are building health strategies, like look at Best Buy and Current. Like I wouldn't have ever expected to see that, but companies that have got a lot of cash on the balance sheet that are now playing catch up to have some kind of health strategy. Maybe that means consolidation won't be as fast as it could be, given that there's a lot of big players with a lot of money that all want a health strategy. It's not like ad tech where there's 5 buyers, and once they've made their 5 acquisitions, the race is over.
I'm just conscious of time. I might jump into a couple of the questions from the chat. I think there's some interesting ones. Maybe looking at like the employer route, I think Shannon had a question there. Is that merely a starting point for user acquisition, data collection, and ROI before kind of pivoting to other possible avenues? I think she said, yeah, I guess getting to the point of, is there kind of a shelf life for actually going the employer route, and is it just a stepping stone to some of the other routes that we discussed?
My 2 cents is, once you commit to the employer route and that channel is working for you, you go all in. And I don't know if that's a pathway to going prescription. I just think, again, back to it's just very different approaches and DNA and requirements of that FDA or no FDA, right? Now we've seen some players like Happify have gone all 3 routes in parallel, or somewhat in parallel, right? As an example.
Yeah, I think I can echo that. Happify is a great example of doing just that. I think we have to follow where the money is and where the market grows. And I think there's going to be some time before we get to the point where the shelf life isn't switching over to maybe a prescription digital therapeutic at this point. I think what Eugene said is right, is that when you're in the employer space and it's working, it is tough now. Think about like what a PBM is going to look at to make formulary decisions on a product that's on the market from a pricing perspective. So I think it changes quite a bit. We had to face that a little bit at Click, and our pipeline is now focused more on a prescription digital therapeutic. We were going to think about doing this kind of bifurcated approach, like you said, start here and end here. But from a payer perspective and in provider engagement, I think it changes things quite a bit, in my opinion.
Is it interesting? Sorry, Jonas, come in.
No, I think a lot has been covered and said. The only thing that I would maybe add is that, be aware of the market dynamics that are happening right now. We're in a field that moves super fast, right? And so if the question has come from the audience, maybe having an idea in mind for a product line or a company, then I would just really look at all the developments that are happening in a specific geography at that time, because it can, there is a bill about digital therapeutics that is being worked on by members of Congress. It's probably, I guess, not going to pass, but who knows? Maybe it does, and it can change something for many conditions or companies in that case. Or, stay close on what's moving on the PBM front. But yeah, if you enter it, I think really double down on it, because you have to have a strategy how you're cutting through the noise.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because when we were chatting about some of the future gazing pieces for the employer section, and I think Laura has kind of mentioned it in her piece, that we were thinking as kind of, I guess, employee churn is getting greater and greater, and this great resignation and things, like we were thinking, are people kind of approaching the space in the way that there might actually be a D2C approach post-employer, that if you've got people using your solutions, they're seeing value from it, is there a case where they might actually be then willing to pay out of pocket, and is that being considered into some of the business models that you only have someone for a year, or should your DTx have worked within that time frame? So it was kind of an interesting discussion we were having on, is there a D2C opportunity post-employer? But I don't know if we've seen anyone actually doing that.
I think usually it's going to be too expensive, right? Like the price, like what you're saving an employer, oftentimes the price to an employer is validated through kind of the health economics that you bring to the table, and oftentimes that is too high of a price point for a consumer to pay out of pocket. That's what we've seen.
I think also to add what Will was talking about earlier around the complexity around pricing strategy and paying for outcomes. I mean, I think we're getting into realms where an employee would have a hard time wrapping their head around outside of just the price point from that regard. And I think it's also, you see the same thing with regular pharmaceutical formularies. And if somebody moves, I mean, it's even better to have that person go to their employer and kind of put pressure up, kind of this bottoms up approach. So I think we have to focus more on that than trying to capture all that, because I think the economics will just be way skewed. And now all of a sudden you're going to have employers or these EBCs or platforms looking at different pricing models out there than is being charged to them.
I mean, we don't have any of the data because a lot of this is private, but obviously in a little bit on the reverse, let's use something like Headspace that went to B2B later, kind of in a PEPM model. I think part of the challenge for digital companies is, cannibalization, right? Because also you don't want to go, to employer on one side, maybe you'll be able to charge more, and then how do you charge that to the consumer? But also the reverse, it's a much smaller footprint PEPM, but then you need to charge a $10 plus per month to the consumer. I do think that if you're providing a unbelievable, human experience and the outcomes that you feel, I think, if I quit a job tomorrow and I'm using something, I will look into it if it's working for me, right? And it just depends on kind of what it is, what therapeutic area, and what I can afford. But I think there are opportunities, but I wouldn't focus it on as a startup on it.
Maybe we can touch on, I know we've kind of covered some of the challenges of keeping up to date with what's happening in the various geographies, and Jonas, you kind of touched on that, but our focus really for this report was the US market. Do we think there could be an opportunity down the line that they will be considering the employer market more kind of seriously in other geographies, or is that an area you guys are seeing when DTx are saying employers? Are they only considering US, or are we starting to see opportunities in other regions?
I think in Europe, we can't, the employer's interest in health is changing, and COVID has definitely, I think, been a forcing function in redefining that relationship, starting with things like Calm and Headspace. I think it's TBC where we get to there, because I just don't think there's economic arguments for them to spend thousands of dollars per employee unless there is some solid data set to talk about long-term retention or something like that. So I think that you're just starting from a different like cultural and like legal responsibility between employer and employees, thinking more from the UK. But I think stuff like fertility and menopause might be quite an interesting forcing function, so playing more into strategic diversity agendas as well, to actually try and reverse that, or at least change it, albeit I reckon the numbers will be a lot smaller, because today, if you're selling whether it's a mental health product or a fertility product or a menopause product, it comes from the HR kind of other budget, which is typically like, if you've got a 50 or 100 grand contract, that's probably a good result for a mid to large size employer, and that will be at the chief people officer kind of sign off. But it's hard, at least I don't envisage employers signing multi-million-dollar a year deals in Europe for something health related today. And so then it becomes quite an interesting, I suppose, strategic decision of, I've got one salesperson, they can either sign 5 deals in the UK, which might get us 200 grand a year, or they could be focused on the US and we could make 5 million a year. Like which one would you choose if you're not kind of market constrained? I think you'd choose the US every time. And so I see that the opportunity outside of the US more from a wellness or well-being perspective today versus kind of health per se.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's great. And to piggyback right on that, or just to drive one point home, in the US, the large employers really carry all the risk, right? And in Europe, it usually the risk is moved onto a public or private health insurance. So there's still need and incentives for those solutions, but it is much more diluted and indirect. And whereas the employer really is interested in maybe not in the first year, right? They kind of want to, and then again, there's so many different employers, as we've earlier said, there's different segments, but I'm talking about the more sophisticated, really large ones. They're maybe, if they're innovative, going to be comfortable putting a solution into their population, but all of them earlier or later are going to look at claims and are going to want to see ROI. And I think that is different in Europe, where ROI is just not as directly linked to that client.
To that point, I think it's so hard to sell on productivity, which is where a lot of businesses find themselves selling into Europe. And even if you can make a robust case on productivity, like the contract values are going to be so much less than you're selling into a US self-insured employer, and you can say, look, you spend X amount per capita for every smoker in your workforce. How about I take that off your books? Like, it's just a completely different economic argument.
To your point, oftentimes there's no reserved money bucket for it either, right? So in Europe, what we saw when we went very early after the German kind of privatized health plans, they had a very small budget for kind of wellness solutions in their population. It was kind of more like innovation, almost like marketing budget to kind of, make them appear as a more innovative health plan because the consumer chooses them. And in the US, it's very different. But even in the US, it's an important, to your earlier point, if you do case rate, it's hard to sometimes get that budget if the HR person is actually signing off on it, versus if it goes through the medical claims, where it lands in the kind of same budget as other health spending.
And I think, sorry to hold the mic, but the more frustrating one, actually, I think, especially when it comes to fertility and femtech, is a phrase that I heard coined of employers paying for like empathy in a box, which is, okay, we don't know what to say to our employees to show that we care, so we're going to pay 30 grand a year for this service, we're going to market the hell out of it via like LinkedIn, all our internal channels, just to show we're an empathetic employer. And then in year 2, we probably won't do it again, and we'll probably drop the contract. And so it's actually like to Jonas's point around like finding a budget and a pot of money for this is really hard. And like the reason for European employers to do this is just very different to why US employers are thinking about it.
We have only a couple of minutes left. I feel like that flew by. I think I'm just having a look through the questions. I think we've covered a lot of them in kind of the consolidation piece and selling with others. So maybe I'll put a question to each of you guys, you know, where you see the employer market going in the next kind of 5 years. What's your key takeaway or key thing people should be focused on if they're looking at this market?
My 2 cents is that every one of those DTx company will really need to build a brand in order for them to be successful, and much more of a patient consumer brand, even if it's going through the employer.
Anyone else chime in on that?
Yeah, I think for me, as we talked about the complexity that's going to come down and all of the DTx on the marketplace, I would say as I see it move forward, focusing on outcomes and cost of care is going to be extremely important, because it's going to get noisy. And so focusing on that, and then that's probably it, because there's ways to get around point solution like we're finding out today.
I agree. I think this is the ultimate way to scale a health business today. Like we're seeing most of our European companies pivot into this route to market in the US. I think if you've got that efficacy and you are in a priority area of spending, it's about aggressively like growing the business. And I think the Kaya folks, Click, like everyone speaks to this of actually whether that comes to fundraising, hiring, like you're against some very well-funded players. And so I think growth expectations and just execution pace is paramount. But I think if you've got the team to do that, and you've got the narrative of how you can convince people that you're going to build a $1 billion business in this space, I think there's almost dynamic. You've got the benefits of B2B contract quality and revenue quality, but with growth rates that you probably would see more commonly in like B2C businesses. So it's kind of the perfect blend if you've got the team that can really execute against that.
I'd probably revisit quickly once more the point that was earlier made about member engagement marketing and the importance of that, because let's not forget, as employers have realized how important these solutions are to provide them to their population, they have already procured more solutions. So more solutions are available to their members, but there needs to be a good way of catching the attention of the member to actually also start and then stay engaged. So maybe just from a product perspective, apart from the business model considerations, I do think it's really important to create a solution that is actually meaningful to the end user. And I feel like as this consolidation of the different channels is happening, the game is moving more from the B2B to the B2C play, where in the end, you're going to have great metrics to show that this population is still engaged in contract year 3, that they are cherishing their outcomes, and that maybe also you're going to have to find a narrative towards your client to say, look, somebody trained with this for a year in year 1, but we have found a way to survey and measure the outcomes that they're still seeing in year 2 or 3, so that you're actually going to continue creating revenue, and it's not like a one-off play on an account by account basis.
We might just be at time, guys. Thank you so much for your time today. I think that was really insightful, and thanks to the audience as well for sharing your questions. And I guess keep an eye out next year. We'll have part 2 of our report, but to the panelists particularly, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.